Hello, everybody. Welcome to Week 12's discussion on Piven and Cloward's influential book from 1977, Poor People's Movements, Why They Succeed, Why They Fail. Let's jump right into it. Piven and Cloward state that common sense and historical experience combine to suggest a simple but compelling view of the roots of power in any society. Crudely but clearly stated, those who control the means of physical coercion, in other words, the superintendents of state violence, and those who control the means of producing wealth, the capitalists, have power over those who do not. This much is true whether the means of coercion consist in the primitive force of a warrior caste or the technological force of a modern army. And it is true whether the control of production consists in control by priests of the mysteries of the calendar on which agriculture depends, or control by financiers of the large-scale capital on which industrial production depends. Since coercive force can be used to gain control of the means of producing wealth, and since control of wealth can be used to gain coercive force, these two sources of power tend over time to be drawn together within one ruling class. Now, recall a reading we had earlier in the semester titled, "The Ruling Class Does Not Rule." Unfortunately, I think that article, or maybe just the title, tripped some of us up. Hopefully, Piven and Cloward help clarify that by putting a fine point on it. These two sources of power tend over time to be drawn together within one ruling class. This is a very memorable book, lots of great passages, so I'm going to quote extensively from it. Piven and Cloward go on to say that power does not simply exist in a corporeal form. No, the sources of power previously mentioned are protected and enlarged by the use of that power, not only to control the actions of men and women, but also to control their beliefs and attitudes. This, you should remember, was a major point of Marx's thought, that of the power of the ideas of the ruling class, in a word, ideology. Also recall our discussion on superstructure, that is, culture. Piven and Cloward say that because this superstructure of beliefs and rituals is evolved in the context of unequal power, it is inevitable that beliefs and rituals reinforce inequality by rendering the powerful divine and the challengers evil. So what does this mean in terms of the class struggle Marx and other radicals spoke of? In relation to, say, U.S. hegemony, their struggle either appears impossible or wrong. In modern capitalist democracies, such as the U.S., power is rooted in the control of coercive force and in the control of the means of production. However, in capitalist societies, this reality is not legitimated by rendering the powerful divine, as in pre-modern times, but by obscuring their existence. In other words, we don't even know a power elite exists. According to Piven and Cloward, electoral representative arrangements proclaim the franchise, not force and wealth, as the basis for the accumulation and use of power. Again, think in terms of Weber here. Conservative political scientists, schooled in the pluralist tradition, claim that there are in fact two systems of power, one based on wealth, one based on votes. Recall McAdams' history of social movement scholarship. Remember that resource mobilization theorists argued that there were not two systems of power, but that the power rooted in wealth and force overwhelmed the power of the franchise. Also recall Piven and Cloward that reading we had earlier in the semester on who votes and who doesn't and why. Non-participation wasn't a rational decision based solely on human agency. Rather, as Piven and Cloward write, modes of participation and the degree of influence that resulted were consistently determined by location in the class structure. It was an important insight. And once it had been achieved, the conclusion followed not far behind, that so long as lower class groups abided by the norms governing the electoral representative system, they would have little influence. It therefore became clear, at least to some of us, that protest tactics, which defined political norms, were not simply the recourse of troublemakers and fools. For the poor, they were the only recourse. But as McAdams pointed out, protest is not a consistent option for the poor. So, what is a protest movement? It first involves a transformation of consciousness. How is this accomplished? Well, first, the system appears to lose legitimacy. Hopefully you're seeing the arc of the syllabus and why Weber, who appears in the footnotes, why his thoughts on legitimacy must first be understood before moving on to Piven and Cloward and other social movement researchers. Second, people began to demand change. Finally, they believe that they can bring about change. The change in behavior, according to Piven and Cloward, is equally striking, and usually more easily recognized, at least when it takes the form of mass strikes or marches or riots. People become defiant, and this defiance assumes a collective character. Piven and Cloward continue their criticism of models that emphasize the conscious intentions of movement actors, which, as they put it, reflects a confusion in the literature between the mass movement on the one hand and the formalized organizations which tend to emerge on the crest of the movement on the other. Two intertwined but distinct phenomena. Thus, formalized organizations do put forward articulated and agreed upon social change goals, as suggested by these definitions. But such goals may not be apparent in mass uprisings, although others, including ourselves as observers and analysts, may well impute goals to uprisings. Furthermore, our emphasis is on collective defiance as the key and distinguishing feature of the protest movement. But defiance tends to be omitted or understated in standard definitions, simply because defiance does not usually characterize the activities of formal organizations that arise on the crest of protest movements. They go on to say, whatever the intellectual source of error, the effect of equating movements with movement organizations, and thus requiring that protests have a leader, a constitution, a legislative program, or at least a banner before they are recognized as such, is to divert attention from many forms of political unrest and to consign them by definition to the more shadowy realm of social problems and deviant behavior. Like other resource mobilization theorists, Piven and Cloward observe that sharp inequality has been constant, but rebellion infrequent. So what factors contribute to social movement emergence? Again, this is probably the most important question, or at least the most common question in social movement research. The penalties for defiance obviously discourage the poor from mobilizing, but what else? They also note that in the United States, the poor are led to believe that their destitution is deserved and that the riches and power that others command are also deserved. Recall the myth of meritocracy in other sociology other classes you've had. Also, I hope you see the role hegemony plays here. Obviously, protests have broken out, and Piven and Cloward concede some degree of agreement with their predecessors on why, saying that movement mobilization reflects profound changes in the larger society. Only under exceptional conditions will the lower classes become defiant, and thus, according to Piven and Cloward, only under exceptional conditions are the lower classes afforded the socially determined opportunity to press forward their own class interest. In a word, these conditions represent the political opportunity. Like McAdam, they outline a series of perspectives that explain mobilization. It seems useful to divide perspectives on insurgency according to whether they emphasize pressures that force eruptions, or whether the emphasis is on the breakdown of the regulatory capacity of the society, a breakdown that permits eruptions to occur and to take form in political protest. The other major set of theoretical perspectives on popular uprising emphasizes the breakdown of the regulatory capacity of social institutions as the principal factor leading to civil strife. However, Piven and Cloward remain skeptical, for neither the frustrations generated by the economic change nor the breakdown of daily life may be sufficient to lead people to protest to travails. Ordinarily, when people suffer such hardships, they blame God or they blame themselves. There's a great quote by Marx that gets at this point. For a protest movement to arise out of the traumas of daily life, says Piven and Cloward, people have to perceive the deprivation and disorganization they experience as both wrong and thus subject to redress. So Piven and Cloward are offering a sociological account as opposed to a psychological account of insurgent participation. Just as quiescence is enforced by institutional life, and just as the eruption of discontent is determined by changes in institutional life, the forms of political protest are also determined by the institutional context in which people live and work. This point echoes Mill's, of course, but according to Piven and Cloward, it is usually ignored, in large part because the pluralist tradition defines political action as essentially a matter of choice. Again, we as sociologists must break away from this hyper-individualistic rational choice way of thinking. One way movements are structured is through electoral politics. But this usually occurs when unrest among the lower classes breaks out of the confines of electoral procedures that the poor may have some influence. For the instability and polarization that they threaten to create by their actions in the factories or in the streets may force some response from our electoral leaders. But when people are encouraged in spirit without being appeased in fact, their defiance may escape the boundaries of electoral rituals and escape the boundaries established by the political norms of the electoral representative system in general. But what factors shape the form of protest? Well, first, people experience deprivation and oppression within a concrete setting, not as the end product of a large and abstract process, and it is the concrete experience that molds their discontents into specific grievances against specific targets. Second, institutional patterns shape mass movements by shaping the collectivity out of which protests can arise. Third, and according to Piven and Cloward, the most important, institutional roles determine the strategic opportunity for defiance, for it is typically by rebelling against the rules and authorities associated with their everyday activities that people protest. So how effective are protests? Piven and Cloward say that the most useful way to think about the effectiveness of protest is to examine the disruptive effects on institutions of different forms of mass defiance, and then to examine the political reverberations of those disruptions. So they say the impact of mass defiance is, in other words, not so much directly as indirectly felt. Protest is more likely to have a seriously disruptive impact when the protesters play a central role in an institution, and is more likely to evoke wider political reverberations when powerful groups have large stakes in the disruptive institution. These relationships are almost totally ignored in the literature on social movements, according to Piven and Cloward. They say, at least in the 1970s, there were no studies that cataloged and examined forms of defiance, the settings in which defiance is acted out, the institutional disruptions that do or do not result, or the varying political reverberations of these institutional disruptions. As I mentioned earlier in the lecture, I've quoted extensively from the readings, and I'm going to conclude with a quote from the reading. The main point of the first chapter, as Piven and Cloward summarize, is that both the limitations and opportunities for mass protest are shaped by social conditions. The implications for the role of leadership in protest movements can be briefly summarized. Protest wells up in response to momentous changes in the institutional order. It is not created by organizers and leaders. Once protest erupts, the specific forms it takes are largely determined by features of social structure. Organizers and leaders who contrive strategies that ignore the social location of the people they seek to mobilize can only fail. Elites respond to the institutional disruptions that protest causes, as well as to the other powerful institutional imperatives. Elite responses are not significantly shaped by the demands of leaders and organizers, nor are elite responses significantly shaped by formally structured organizations of the poor. Whatever influence lower class groups occasionally exert in American politics does not result from organization, but from mass protest and the disruptive consequences of that protest.